This is a true horror story about a single, locked door inside my childhood home, a deeply unsettling real experience that fundamentally changed my understanding of the physical world and permanently destroyed my sense of safety. Many people casually browse the internet late at night looking for a fictional scary story to give themselves a fleeting, entertaining thrill before safely drifting off to a peaceful sleep, completely secure in the comforting belief that their physical reality is entirely predictable and that the walls of their home provide an absolute barrier against the unknown. But when the very foundation of your security is built around an impossible, silent secret hidden right down the hall from where you sleep, that comforting illusion eventually collapses, leaving you completely trapped in a waking paranoia that never truly goes away. I grew up in a sprawling, slightly outdated, two-story colonial house situated deep in the heavily wooded, rural outskirts of Pennsylvania. It was a beautiful, quiet property, completely surrounded by acres of dense, ancient pine trees that isolated us from the nearest neighbors and swallowed any ambient noise from the distant highway. Living in an old family house for your entire life means you intimately learn exactly how the structure breathes. You learn the specific, natural creaks of the wooden floorboards as the temperature drops, the low, comforting hum of the basement furnace pushing warm air through the metal vents, and the heavy, mechanical groans of the roof settling under the weight of winter snow. But there was one specific, architectural detail in that house that absolutely never felt normal, a localized point of intense, psychological gravity that my entire family actively, silently conspired to completely ignore. At the absolute very end of the long, narrow, dimly lit upstairs hallway, situated directly past my bedroom and the master suite, was a small, completely ordinary-looking locked door. The family never, ever explained why it was locked, and they absolutely never explained why we were strictly forbidden from approaching it. The door itself looked entirely unremarkable, possessing a narrow wooden frame that seemed slightly too small for the surrounding architecture, heavily coated in a thick, fading layer of pale white paint that had slowly chipped and peeled over the decades to reveal dark, stained wood underneath. It had an old, tarnished brass knob that had turned a dull, sickly green from years of absolute neglect, a knob that I had never once seen anyone in my family attempt to turn. But everyone in the house avoided it with a meticulous, silent dedication that was far more terrifying than any spoken warning. I vividly remember countless, subtle incidents throughout my childhood that slowly built a heavy, suffocating aura of unspoken dread around that specific end of the corridor. I remember noticing how my parents would become visibly, physically uncomfortable whenever they had to walk past it, their relaxed posture suddenly turning rigid, their eyes strictly locked straight ahead, completely refusing to even casually glance at the faded white paint. I remember whenever extended family or new guests would visit for the holidays, they would inevitably, naturally ask about the strange, small door at the end of the hall, and my parents would always offer a tight, highly rehearsed, deeply artificial smile, smoothly pretending not to notice the heavy tension in the air as they casually dismissed it as a broken storage closet with a jammed lock. The guests would always politely nod, clearly sensing the sudden, cold shift in the atmosphere, and they would immediately pretend not to notice it for the entire remainder of their stay. But something felt wrong. Even as a child, I could completely feel the deep, fundamental wrongness of the space immediately surrounding that narrow wooden frame. There was always a strange, highly unnatural silence around the hallway at night, a dense, static void that seemed to aggressively swallow the normal, comforting background noises of the old house, creating a highly pressurized zone where the air always felt significantly colder and much heavier than the rest of the second floor. Our family dog, a large, energetic golden retriever who fearlessly roamed every single other inch of the sprawling property, would absolutely refuse to cross the invisible boundary marking the final 10 feet of that corridor. If a tennis ball accidentally rolled toward the tarnished brass knob, he would simply sit down on the runner rug, stare intently at the faded white wood, and quietly, nervously whine until someone physically retrieved it for him. For 19 years, I lived entirely with this unspoken, heavily guarded secret, simply accepting the locked door as a bizarre, eccentric quirk of my childhood home, burying my natural, human curiosity under a layer of conditioned, deeply ingrained obedience. But then, during my sophomore year of college, I returned home for the winter holidays, completely unaware that the fragile, silent truce my family had maintained with whatever was hidden in that room was about to permanently, terrifyingly break. It was a bitterly cold, completely windless Tuesday night in the absolute middle of January. A massive, unprecedented winter storm had aggressively rolled through the valley earlier that afternoon, heavily blanketing the entire property in several feet of thick, undisturbed snow and plunging the isolated house into a deafening, suffocating, pitch-black silence. The heavy snow actively insulated the walls, completely absorbing the ambient noise of the outside world and leaving the interior of the house feeling incredibly, claustrophobically quiet. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was lying awake in my dark bedroom, staring blankly at the pale shadows cast across my plaster ceiling by the moonlight filtering through the frosted windowpane. The absolute stillness of the sleeping house was profound, a heavy, dead silence that made my highly sensitive inner ears faintly ring. That was when I noticed it. It started as an incredibly faint, highly subtle vibration echoing through the silent architecture of the second floor. I held my breath, the warm blood cooling in my tired veins, and listened intently to the dark hallway entirely outside my closed bedroom door. Then, the sound happened again, slightly louder, carrying clearly through the freezing, stagnant indoor air. It was a knock. But it was absolutely not the random, chaotic thud of a settling water pipe or the heavy snapping of frozen wooden siding reacting to the bitter winter chill. It was the distinct, undeniable, highly deliberate sound of a physical knuckle gently striking solid wood. I sat perfectly, rigidly still in the center of my mattress, my frantically beating heart hammering against my tight ribs exactly like a trapped bird. The sound was not aggressive. It was not the loud, frantic, panicked pounding of someone desperately needing immediate, earthly help. It was just a slow, calm, incredibly patient knock. Tap. A pause lasting exactly 5 seconds. Tap. Another highly measured pause. Tap. The terrifying, impossible acoustic reality of the situation aggressively revealed itself to my fully awakened, highly alert brain. The slow, methodical knocking was undeniably, clearly originating from the absolute very end of the upstairs hallway. It was coming directly from the faded, white wooden panel of the small, forbidden door. But the detail that completely paralyzed my freezing lungs and sent a massive shockwave of pure primal dread tearing straight down my spine was the unmistakable resonance of the sound. The quiet, polite tapping was absolutely not hitting the exterior surface of the door from the hallway side. The muffled, heavy acoustic thud clearly indicated that the slow knock was coming from the other side of the locked door. It was coming entirely from inside the dark, empty, forbidden space that had supposedly been sealed shut for decades. I slowly, agonizingly pushed the heavy, warm quilts completely off my chest, my bare feet sinking painfully into the freezing hardwood floorboards as I quietly stood up in the pitch-black darkness of my bedroom. I desperately, pathetically tried to rationalize the impossible anomaly using cold, hard, desperate logic. I forcefully convinced my rapidly fracturing mind that an earthly, logical explanation had to exist, perhaps a visiting relative, an older aunt or a sleepwalking cousin, had somehow miraculously managed to pry the jammed lock open during the day, wandered inside the cluttered storage space looking for extra blankets, and accidentally managed to lock themselves inside the freezing, unlit room. It was a weak, pathetic, highly improbable theory, but human psychological denial is an incredibly powerful defense mechanism when confronted with an impossible reality. I slowly turned my brass doorknob and pulled my bedroom door open, stepping out into the long, dark, heavily shadowed central corridor. The moonlight spilling through the window at the absolute end of the hall cast a long, pale, sickly beam of light directly across the faded white paint and the tarnished brass knob of the locked door. The entire upstairs was bathed in a heavy, freezing, deeply unnatural silence. I stood perfectly still on the woven runner rug, my rapid, terrified breath forming faint white clouds of condensation in the dropping ambient temperature. I listened. The heavy, pressurized silence held for 10 agonizing seconds. And then, it happened again. Tap. A slow, careful, highly measured knock from inside the dark room. The sound was incredibly polite, entirely lacking any frantic human desperation, conveying a terrifying, ancient patience that actively attacked my fragile sanity. I knew I couldn't just stand there in the dark, and I absolutely did not possess the blind courage to walk directly up to that door alone. I immediately turned around and walked quickly and silently down the opposite end of the hallway, heading directly toward the large master suite where my parents were sleeping. I carefully opened their heavy oak door, the hinges completely silent, and crept over to my father's side of the large bed. I gently shook his shoulder. He woke up with a slight start, blinking his tired eyes in the dark room, his face looking confused and groggy. "Dad," I whispered, my voice violently trembling with a mixture of raw fear and desperate urgency. "Dad, wake up. Listen to me. I think someone is trapped inside the storage room at the end of the hall. They're knocking on the door from the inside." I expected him to immediately sit up, flip on the bedside lamp, grab his heavy metal flashlight from the nightstand, and march down the hallway to investigate the emergency like a normal, protective parent. But his reaction fundamentally, completely shattered my illusion of safety. The exact microscopic second the words left my pale lips, my father completely froze. He did not move a single muscle. He did not reach for the light. Even in the dim, heavily shadowed room, I could clearly see all the natural color completely and instantly drain from his face, leaving his skin looking exactly like pale, cold ash. A look of pure, unadulterated, suppressed terror aggressively washed over his features. He slowly pushed himself up on his elbows, staring intensely at me with wide, terrified eyes. He didn't ask me what it sounded like. He didn't ask me how long it had been happening. He simply stared at me in the heavy, static silence for several agonizing seconds before speaking. His voice was incredibly low, completely flat, and entirely devoid of any comforting parental warmth. "There's nobody in there," he whispered, his tone absolutely final and deeply chilling. "Go back to your room. Close your door. Do not go near that end of the hall." He didn't say it like a reassuring father trying to calm a frightened child. He said it exactly like a desperate, terrified man issuing a critical, life-or-death warning. I stood there, completely stunned, my mind frantically trying to process the heavy, terrifying implication of his words. He knew. My parents absolutely, undeniably knew exactly what was inside that locked, freezing room, and they had spent their entire adult lives silently, patiently living right down the hall from it, completely terrified to ever acknowledge its existence. I slowly backed out of their bedroom, quietly pulling the door shut, leaving me entirely alone in the long, dark, freezing corridor once again. I should have listened to him. I should have walked directly back into my bedroom, locked the door, climbed under the heavy blankets, and completely ignored the impossible reality of the house. I still can't explain it, but a deep, hypnotic, highly invasive compulsion aggressively anchored my freezing feet to the floorboards. The tension between my deep, primal fear and an overwhelming, highly toxic curiosity violently waged war inside my exhausted brain. I slowly turned my head and looked back down the long hallway toward the pale moonlight illuminating the small, faded wooden door. The silence of the old house was deafening. And then, the patient knocking continued. Tap. 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 Slow. Careful. Measured. The sound wasn't just echoing in the physical hallway, it felt as though it was actively vibrating directly inside my inner eardrums, heavily pulling me forward like a dark, invisible tether. I slowly, meticulously began to walk down the hallway, entirely ignoring every single screaming survival instinct demanding that I turn around. With every single slow, agonizing step I took toward the end of the corridor, the ambient temperature aggressively plummeted, the bitter chill biting deeply into my exposed skin. The stagnant air smelled faintly of old, undisturbed dust and something deeply metallic, exactly like freezing copper. I reached the very end of the runner rug and stopped exactly 2 feet away from the locked door. The tarnished, sickly green brass knob was positioned perfectly at the height of my waist. The chipped, peeling white lead paint looked incredibly stark and highly detailed in the pale, blue moonlight. I stood perfectly, rigidly still, holding my breath, actively listening to the complete, heavy silence emanating from the other side of the narrow wooden frame. The knocking had temporarily stopped. The entity, the presence, or whatever impossible thing was patiently occupying the dark void inside the forbidden room, seemed to fundamentally, completely understand that I was finally standing right outside. I could physically, undeniably feel an intense, massive, freezing weight aggressively pressing against the interior side of the wood, a profound barometric pressure that made the thin gap beneath the door seem to aggressively radiate pure, toxic cold. The horror of simply waiting in the dead silence was immense, an overwhelming, psychological torture that slowly tore my fragile sanity to shreds. I needed to know. I desperately, completely needed to know if the sound was real, or if my isolated, sleep-deprived mind was finally breaking. I slowly, agonizingly raised my violently trembling right hand, my cold, pale fingers hovering mere microscopic inches away from the heavily textured surface of the old, faded wood. I hesitated for a fraction of a single, highly pressurized second, my heart stalling completely in my tight chest, before I finally pushed my hand forward. I placed my open palm completely flat against the center of the solid wooden panel. The wood was incredibly, painfully cold, feeling exactly like a thick slab of solid winter ice. I kept my hand pressed firmly against the door, completely terrified to move, simply staring blankly at my own pale skin resting on the white paint. The old house remained perfectly, flawlessly silent. And then, exactly against the very center of my resting palm, originating completely from the pitch-black, forbidden, locked space on the other side of the solid wood, something incredibly cold and impossibly strong slowly, deliberately knocked back exactly where my hand was touching. The heavy, solid oak door located at the absolute end of the long, deeply shadowed second-floor hallway rapidly transformed from a simple, easily ignored architectural curiosity into a deeply consuming, suffocating psychological obsession that actively began to tear my fragile sanity into tiny, irreparable pieces. Following the deeply terrifying, inexplicable events of that first freezing night, my exhausted, rational mind desperately tried to forcefully convince me that I had simply experienced a highly vivid, sleep-deprived auditory hallucination, a completely harmless trick of the old, settling house perfectly designed to terrify a paranoid imagination. I desperately wanted to completely believe that the heavy, secure deadbolt was simply protecting an old, forgotten storage closet filled entirely with mundane, dusty family heirlooms and heavy winter coats. But living through a terrifying real experience permanently poisons your perception of the physical world, violently stripping away the comforting illusion of safety and leaving you completely trapped in a waking, suffocating paranoia that entirely overwrites your fundamental understanding of reality. I found myself completely unable to sleep, my dry, burning eyes staring intensely at the dark plaster ceiling of my bedroom for agonizing, heavily pressurized hours, actively straining my highly sensitive inner eardrums to pierce through the dense, static silence of the isolated house. I began meticulously, silently creeping out of my warm bed in the absolute dead of the freezing night, my bare feet sinking painfully into the cold hardwood floorboards as I slowly walked down the pitch-black corridor to sit quietly in the heavy shadows directly across from the locked door. I would sit perfectly, rigidly still in the freezing dark for hours, entirely consumed by a raw, creeping dread, simply watching the faint, sickly pale moonlight slowly crawl across the worn, scratched surface of the ancient wood. The deeply unsettling knocking absolutely did not stop after that first terrifying incident. In fact, the impossible, heavy sounds began happening significantly, terrifyingly more often, establishing a dark, highly methodical pattern that violently attacked my rapidly fracturing mind. It always happened late at night, exclusively beginning long after the distant, ambient sounds of the passing highway had completely faded into the heavy winter silence, exactly when the sprawling, isolated house felt entirely swallowed by an impenetrable, pitch-black void. The sound was never frantic, never chaotic, and it absolutely never resembled the desperate, heavy pounding of someone trying to physically break out of a locked room. It was always agonizingly slow. It was always meticulously, mathematically deliberate. And most terrifyingly of all, it was always incredibly, deeply patient. Tap. A long, heavy, suffocating silence that stretched for 5 agonizing minutes, actively forcing my frantically beating heart to hammer aggressively against my tight ribs. Tap. It was a dark, highly intelligent rhythm specifically designed to completely command my absolute, undivided biological attention, a slow psychological torture that kept me completely paralyzed in the freezing dark. As the exhausting, sleepless weeks slowly dragged on, I began to notice deeply disturbing, impossible patterns hidden within the quiet, methodical impacts that permanently destroyed any remaining hope of a logical, earthly explanation. I sat entirely alone in the pitch-black hallway one freezing Tuesday night, my exhausted head resting heavily against the cold plaster wall, when I realized with a massive, sickening drop in my stomach that the gentle knocks were actively mimicking the exact rhythm of my own biological breathing. I would slowly, carefully inhale the freezing, stale indoor air, and a soft tap would immediately echo from the other side of the heavy wood. I would hold my tight, cramping breath in pure, unadulterated terror, and the dark space behind the door would remain completely, flawlessly silent, patiently waiting for my lungs to burn. The exact microscopic second I finally exhaled, another gentle, mocking tap would instantly vibrate through the floorboards. It was actively, intimately listening to me breathe through the solid oak barrier, perfectly synchronizing its massive, unseen presence with my own fragile, terrified life force. But something felt fundamentally, impossibly wrong about the physical acoustic nature of the quiet sounds. That was when I noticed it. The distinct, heavy sound of the knocking did not consistently originate from the exact center of the door at a normal, biological human height. The impossible, heavy impacts actively moved around entirely behind the solid barrier with a terrifying, deeply unnatural fluidity that completely bypassed the immutable laws of physical motion. I would hear a soft, deliberate tap originate from the extreme, upper left corner of the heavy wooden frame, nearly 8 feet off the ground. Then, entirely without the heavy, shuffling sound of footsteps or the shifting of physical weight, a second tap would immediately, instantly echo from the absolute bottom right corner, mere microscopic inches above the dark floorboards. Whatever was patiently standing in the pitch-black, forgotten space was either impossibly tall with incredibly elongated, spindly limbs that could effortlessly reach every single corner of the massive door simultaneously, or there was a highly terrifying, deeply unnatural entity that could actively glide through the dark void without making a single sound. And then, the true horror story violently escalated. During the deepest, darkest hours of the early morning, completely shattering my isolated reality. Occasionally, the slow, patient, methodical tapping would abruptly, unexpectedly transform into a massive, highly chaotic flurry of countless, synchronized impacts. I sat completely frozen in the dark corridor, my pale lips clamped tightly shut, as dozens of individual, heavy knocks violently struck the entire surface of the solid oak door at the exact same time. It sounded exactly, sickeningly like a massive, swarming cluster of heavy, unyielding hands were all pressing aggressively against the wood, tapping a chaotic, deafening rhythm that was entirely, physically impossible for a single human being to produce. It was a terrifying, undeniable confirmation that the isolated, forgotten room did not simply contain a single, trapped anomaly, but was heavily saturated with a dense, towering, heavily populated darkness actively trying to establish contact. I desperately, pathetically tried to seek out any form of earthly, logical comfort from my parents, entirely hoping that they possessed a mundane, highly rational explanation for the impossible occurrences deeply infecting our family home. But the deep, unsettling silence surrounding the locked door actively extended to the waking, daylight hours of my family's normal life. My parents absolutely, entirely refused to discuss the heavy oak door at the end of the hallway. When I slowly, carefully brought up the strange, slow knocking during a quiet, heavily pressurized Sunday breakfast, the entire, comforting atmosphere of the bright kitchen violently plummeted to a bitter, biting chill. My mother completely stopped moving, her trembling hand tightly gripping a white porcelain coffee mug so incredibly hard that her knuckles turned painfully white, her wide, terrified eyes entirely refusing to look away from the dark surface of the table. My father's usually calm, relaxed face instantly drained of all healthy, biological color, becoming entirely pale and deeply drawn, possessing the exact heavy, haunted look of a man who had spent his entire adult life desperately carrying a massive, toxic secret that he was entirely terrified to fully acknowledge. He slowly placed his heavy hands perfectly flat on the wooden table, staring intensely into my exhausted eyes, and in a low, completely flat, entirely emotionless voice that violently echoed the heavy, static silence of the isolated house, he taught me the one horrifying, absolute rule of our family. If it knocks, never knock back. He absolutely refused to elaborate, entirely ignoring my desperate, frantic questions and immediately, aggressively changing the subject to the mundane, boring details of the upcoming winter weather. The deeply sickening, impossible realization instantly froze the hot blood circulating in my tired veins. They completely, undeniably knew exactly what impossible, towering anomaly was actively occupying the empty space behind the heavy wood, and they had silently, patiently built their entire, supposedly safe lives around completely ignoring its heavy, unblinking presence. The strict, unspoken law of the isolated house was a game of absolute, terrifying patience, a dark, heavy understanding that the entity trapped in the dark possessed all of eternity to patiently wait for a single, microscopic moment of human weakness. The sheer, overwhelming psychological pressure violently pushed me to aggressively seek out concrete, physical answers in the waking world, desperately needing to physically prove to myself that the door was actively holding back a tangible, earthly threat and not just a slow, descending madness entirely consuming my mind. The very next afternoon, while my parents were completely occupied outside in the freezing winter air, I slowly, meticulously crept down the silent hallway holding a bright, heavy LED flashlight, completely determined to closely inspect the heavy oak frame in the comforting, pale light of the day. I knelt down on the cold hardwood floorboards, turning on the harsh, piercing white beam and carefully running the bright light entirely along the deep, narrow crack separating the heavy door from the ancient wooden frame. The terrifying, impossible physical evidence actively revealed itself in the harsh illumination, permanently turning this into a scary story that I will absolutely never escape. The heavy, solid wooden doorframe was completely, entirely covered in incredibly deep, ancient, highly frantic scratches. They were absolutely not the small, chaotic, random marks of a trapped animal desperately trying to dig its way out. They were massive, long, incredibly deep gouges violently carved directly into the hard oak wood, exactly matching the terrifying dimensions of impossibly long, unyielding human fingers desperately trying to pry the heavy frame completely apart from the inside. The deep, jagged scratches were highly layered, some looking incredibly old and completely dark with age, while others looked significantly, terrifyingly fresher, cutting cleanly through the thick layers of peeling white paint. I slowly moved the harsh beam of the flashlight directly onto the heavy, rusted brass deadbolt securely locking the door entirely shut. That was when I noticed the highly disturbing, chaotic layers of thick, messy paint heavily surrounding the metal locking mechanism. The smooth surface of the wood directly under the heavy brass plate was completely ruined, entirely filled with dozens of old, stripped, heavily damaged screw holes clumsily covered by thick coats of white paint. The heavy, brass deadbolt was absolutely, undeniably not the original lock. It had been aggressively, violently replaced many, many times over the long, agonizing decades. The heavy, physical evidence proved beyond a single shadow of a doubt that my father, and his father entirely before him, had been constantly, secretly replacing the heavy locking mechanism because whatever was actively standing perfectly still in the pitch-black void kept completely destroying the heavy metal from the inside out. I slowly backed entirely away from the door, my entire body violently trembling with pure, toxic adrenaline, completely realizing that the heavy oak door was absolutely not a simple, passive architectural feature, but an active, heavily damaged, desperate physical barricade constantly under silent, patient siege. The heavy, static atmosphere of the isolated house violently shifted later that exact same week when a massive, unprecedented, highly aggressive winter storm aggressively rolled through the deep valley, heavily plunging the entire property into a deafening, heavy, suffocating darkness. The ambient barometric pressure inside the old house rapidly plummeted, making my highly sensitive inner ears physically ache with a sharp, piercing pain, while the freezing winter wind violently howled against the thick, frosted window panes exactly like a massive, unseen predator desperately trying to tear the roof apart. I sat completely alone in the pitch-black hallway, staring intensely at the locked door, entirely mesmerized by the terrifying, physical reaction the massive barricade had to the chaotic weather. The heavy oak door absolutely did not rattle loosely with the violent wind drafts, instead, it subtly, terrifyingly shifted slightly inward toward the hallway. The thick, solid wood heavily groaned and violently creaked against the heavy iron hinges, bowing deeply under the immense, crushing physical weight of something massive and unyielding actively pressing its entire, towering bulk directly against the interior surface, entirely using the chaotic noise of the storm to heavily test the structural integrity of the ancient locks. I could physically, undeniably feel the intense, freezing presence violently radiating directly through the solid wood, a heavy, toxic, highly predatory aura that actively squeezed the precious oxygen right out of my tight, cramping lungs. I completely stopped breathing, my pale hands gripping the floorboards, desperately praying to whatever was listening that the heavy brass deadbolt would successfully hold back the massive, dark tide pressing against it. The heavy, hypnotic, deeply invasive paranoia completely shattered the final, lingering remnants of my human sanity over the following, agonizing weeks. The severe, completely unbroken sleep deprivation actively began to deeply hallucinate my exhausted mind, blurring the heavy, distinct line between waking reality and the dark, suffocating nightmares actively invading my safe bedroom. I was entirely, completely running on empty, my dry, burning eyes completely bloodshot, my heavy body violently shaking with a constant, cold sweat. Entirely driven by the desperate, screaming need for just one single, peaceful night of undisturbed rest. One night, a freezing, completely silent Thursday entirely devoid of wind or weather, I found myself sitting completely exhausted on the cold hardwood floor exactly outside the heavy oak door. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. The sprawling, isolated house was completely wrapped in a deafening, heavily pressurized, absolute silence. My heavy, tired head was resting gently against the peeling plaster wall, my violently trembling hands resting completely limp in my lap, my deeply exhausted mind actively floating in a highly dangerous, gray twilight state between wakefulness and absolute, crushing unconsciousness. Then, the heavy, static silence was abruptly, deliberately broken. Tap. A slow, gentle, highly methodical knock softly echoed directly from the other side of the heavy wood, mere microscopic inches entirely away from my resting body. I let out a long, violently trembling, deeply frustrated sigh, completely failing to summon the primal, screaming terror that usually accompanied the impossible sounds. I was just so incredibly, profoundly tired. The heavy, toxic exhaustion actively overrode my ancient, deep survival instincts, violently suppressing the terrified memories of my father's pale face and his absolute, unyielding warning. Tap. The slow, patient sound vibrated entirely through the floorboards, a dark, intelligent rhythm actively demanding my full, undivided biological attention. I slowly, agonizingly shifted my heavy weight, my right arm feeling exactly like thick, unyielding lead as I tiredly lifted it from my lap. I just desperately, pathetically wanted the impossible, psychological torture to stop, completely desiring to break the heavy, endless cycle of waiting in the dark. I didn't think. I didn't process the impossible, terrifying reality of my actions. Completely half asleep, deeply frustrated, and entirely consumed by a blinding, overwhelming exhaustion, I lazily extended my pale, shaking hand. I gently, carelessly rested my knuckles directly against the cold, worn surface of the heavy oak door. The heavy, intoxicating pull of sleep was actively dragging my mind into the dark void, and in a single, microscopic, entirely fatal moment of sheer, unadulterated human weakness, I accidentally twitched my heavy fingers. Thud. I accidentally tapped my fingers directly against the solid wood, actively creating a soft, clear, undeniable answering knock that completely echoed through the freezing, silent hallway. The deeply sickening, massive, heavy, toxic realization instantly and violently slammed directly into my chest exactly like a massive, heavy iron sledgehammer, instantly completely waking my exhausted brain and entirely freezing the hot blood rapidly circulating in my tired veins. I had knocked back. The immediate, deafening, heavy response to my accidental, fatal action was completely, terrifyingly not what my panicked mind had expected. There was absolutely no violent, chaotic pounding on the door. There was no massive, unearthly scream echoing from the pitch-black void. Instead, a profound, deeply unnatural, highly predatory silence immediately, aggressively swallowed the entire isolated house. The heavy, static void actively completely erased the faint, comforting mechanical hum of the basement furnace and the natural, settling creaks of the old wooden walls. It was a thick, suffocating, perfectly absolute silence that aggressively pressed against my highly sensitive inner eardrums, a dead, unyielding vacuum that actively squeezed the precious, thin oxygen right out of my tight, cramping lungs. I sat perfectly, rigidly still on the freezing floorboards, my wide, unblinking eyes staring intensely at the heavy brass handle, entirely paralyzed by a raw, screaming, animalistic fear that completely saturated my fragile soul. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't move a single, violently aching muscle, completely terrified to draw a natural breath or even violently blink my burning eyes. The silence stretched for an agonizing, heavily pressurized eternity, a slow, deeply psychological torture that actively and meticulously tore my remaining sanity into tiny, irreparable shreds. I was entirely, completely waiting for the massive, towering entity to finally, violently breach the physical barrier. And then, the true horror of the situation slowly, methodically began to physically unfold right in front of my wide, disbelieving eyes. The heavy, rusted brass door handle, the exact same ancient mechanism that had remained perfectly, securely locked for countless, forgotten decades, slowly, incredibly deliberately began to physically move. The heavy, metallic, highly agonizing squeak of the ancient internal mechanism violently and deafeningly echoed through the dead, static silence of the hallway. I physically, undeniably watched the smooth, cold brass slowly, mechanically rotate downward, completely turning entirely by itself, entirely ignoring the immutable, unbreakable laws of physical matter and the heavy brass deadbolt supposedly securing the barrier. The slow, smooth rotation was perfectly, mathematically precise, entirely lacking the heavy, chaotic, rushed stumbling of a normal, biological human being opening a door. It was the terrifying, absolute, heavy patience of an ancient, unblinking anomaly that completely understood it had finally, undeniably been invited to cross the threshold. The heavy internal latch violently, loudly clicked back into the metal casing with a sharp, sickening metallic snap that actively sounded exactly like a heavy bone breaking in the freezing dark. I remained perfectly, statue-like still, my rapid, terrified breath completely stalling dead in my tight chest, entirely unable to look away from the physical impossibility actively breaching my isolated sanctuary. The massive, solid oak wood slowly, heavily groaned against the ancient iron hinges. The thick, static, freezing air pooling deeply in the dark hallway violently rushed forward, aggressively pulled into the heavy, suffocating vacuum of the completely unknown, pitch-black space exactly behind the frame. The locked door slowly opens a few inches for the first time. The exact microscopic second that heavy, ancient wooden door finally, stubbornly yielded and cracked open just a single, fragile inch, the entire physical and psychological atmosphere of the long central hallway fundamentally and terrifyingly changed. Living through a deeply unsettling real experience permanently alters your biological perception of your own home, completely transforming a familiar, comforting sanctuary into a highly pressurized, suffocating trap that actively works against your survival. I stood perfectly, rigidly still on the worn hardwood floorboards, my violently trembling hand entirely frozen just inches away from the rusted brass doorknob, entirely paralyzed by the sudden, massive shift in the ambient environment. An incredibly sharp, bitter, highly unnatural, freezing cold air immediately began to slowly, methodically bleed directly out of the narrow, pitch-black crack, actively washing over my pale, sweating face and violently chilling the warm blood circulating in my tired veins. It was absolutely not the normal, refreshing draft of an old house naturally settling in the winter night, it was a heavy, stagnant, deeply toxic chill that smelled strongly and sickeningly of undisturbed, ancient dust, damp, rotting earth, and a faint, highly metallic scent exactly like old copper or dried blood. The heavy, comforting, familiar silence of my isolated home was instantly, violently swallowed by a dense, oppressive, highly predatory void, a thick barometric pressure that actively squeezed the precious oxygen right out of my tight, cramping lungs and made my sensitive inner eardrums physically ache with a sharp, high-altitude pain. I stared intensely into the narrow, pitch-black vertical sliver of empty space, completely terrified to move a single, violently aching muscle, desperately praying that the dense shadows pooling heavily inside the forbidden room would simply remain still. But something felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally, and impossibly wrong about the exact, specific way the darkness inside the room seemed to actively, aggressively push back against the faint ambient light of the hallway. Through the extreme, highly sensitive, blurry edges of my biological peripheral vision, I could clearly, undeniably see subtle, chaotic, highly unnatural movement actively shifting deep within the suffocating darkness of the room. It was absolutely not a distinct, physical shape, but a heavy, fluid displacement of the shadows themselves, a deeply terrifying optical illusion perfectly accompanied by incredibly faint, microscopic sounds that absolutely did not belong in an empty, sealed space. I heard the highly subtle, dry, rhythmic scraping of something heavy and textured slowly, meticulously shifting against the bare wooden floorboards, a sound so deeply unsettling that it instantly sent a massive shockwave of pure, unadulterated primal dread tearing straight down my rigid spine. My ancient, screaming, frantic survival instincts violently commanded my exhausted body to immediately slam the heavy door completely shut, to violently engage the rusted lock, and to completely abandon the isolated property entirely into the freezing night. But the heavy, hypnotic, deeply invasive psychological compulsion actively radiating from the open crack forcefully anchored my trembling legs to the spot, completely stripping away my ability to flee. I desperately, pathetically tried to rationally explain the terrifying anomaly away using cold, hard, earthly logic, forcefully convincing my rapidly fracturing mind that I was simply experiencing a severe, localized visual and auditory hallucination directly caused by extreme sleep deprivation and blinding panic. I slowly, agonizingly backed entirely away from the heavy door, completely refusing to turn my exposed, vulnerable back to the open crack, and silently retreated entirely into my master bedroom, firmly locking the heavy wooden door behind me. I spent the entire remainder of that agonizing, heavily pressurized night lying perfectly, rigidly still in my freezing bed, staring blankly at the dark plaster ceiling, entirely unable to ignore the heavy, terrifying reality that the forbidden door was now partially open. I waited desperately for the pale, gray light of the morning sun to finally wash away the suffocating darkness, foolishly believing that the daylight would entirely break the psychological spell. But this true horror story was absolutely not ending with the sunrise, it was only just beginning its slow, methodical, highly predatory escalation into a waking nightmare that would permanently poison my existence. Over the course of the next several agonizing, deeply isolating nights, the terrifying, impossible reality actively bleeding out of that forgotten room violently escalated, completely destroying the final, fragile, clinging remnants of my human sanity. The first, highly disturbing detail to aggressively reveal itself to my exhausted brain was the physical state of the heavy wooden door itself. Every single morning, when I finally gathered the desperate, blinding courage to slowly creep down the dark hallway to inspect the forbidden threshold, I physically, undeniably noticed that the narrow, vertical opening was becoming slightly, terrifyingly wider. I absolutely never touched the rusted brass doorknob again, and I absolutely never physically pushed against the heavy wood, but the dark, empty crack slowly, methodically expanded from a single inch to 3 inches, then to half a foot. The ancient, heavy door was moving seamlessly and silently on its rusted hinges exactly as if an invisible, highly patient force was meticulously, deliberately pushing its massive bulk entirely out into the hallway, slowly preparing to breach the absolute boundary of the room. And the knocking. The slow, polite, highly methodical tapping that had aggressively haunted my isolated existence for weeks, the very sound that had driven me to foolishly, desperately open the heavy door in the first place, had completely, terrifyingly stopped. The total, absolute absence of the knocking was infinitely worse, vastly heavier, and terrifyingly more oppressive than the sound itself. The silence was absolutely no longer a peaceful absence of noise, it was a heavy, pregnant, deeply malevolent anticipation, a massive, unblinking trap patiently waiting for its final, necessary component to seamlessly fall into place. That was when I noticed it. The profound, psychological dread violently shifted from the sealed room completely into the open, waking reality of the rest of the house, a terrifying confirmation that the invisible boundary had fundamentally, permanently collapsed. The heavy, wet, highly deliberate sound of slow footsteps suddenly, quietly began to echo in entirely different, supposedly safe areas of my isolated home in the absolute dead of the night. I would be sitting perfectly, rigidly still in the dark, silent living room, entirely consumed by the heavy, toxic energy saturating the stale indoor air, and I would clearly, undeniably hear the distinct, heavy squeak of a familiar floorboard slowly depressing in the distant, empty kitchen. Tap. Squeak. Drag. The footsteps were incredibly, profoundly unnatural, highly measured, deeply careful, and completely devoid of the heavy, chaotic, rhythmic stumbling of a normal, biological human being casually walking through their home. The unseen entity was actively, meticulously exploring the physical architecture of my safe sanctuary, silently wandering through the dark, empty rooms while I remained completely, helplessly paralyzed in my chair, too terrified to even draw a single, natural breath. I started finding highly subtle, deeply disturbing physical evidence of the invisible intrusion actively scattered across the silent property, completely defying the normal, logical placement of inanimate matter. Small, mundane household objects were moving slightly, terrifyingly out of place when I wasn't directly observing them, entirely rejecting the immutable laws of static reality. My heavy metal keys, which I always meticulously placed perfectly in the dead center of the wooden entryway table, would suddenly be resting entirely on the absolute edge of the polished surface, exactly as if long, pale, unseen fingers had gently, deliberately pushed them toward the floor just seconds before I entered the room. The heavy ceramic coffee cups resting silently in the dark kitchen dish rack would be turned exactly 90 degrees, their handles pointing in completely unnatural, highly calculated directions. The heavy, dark television screen in the living room occasionally reflected a room that felt entirely, subtly wrong, as if the physical space of the house was being actively, aggressively manipulated by the massive, freezing, unblinking presence actively roaming the shadows. The intense, overwhelming feeling of being intimately, malevolently watched completely saturated my fragile soul, an immense, crushing barometric pressure that violently anchored me to my own terrifying, absolute helplessness. This was absolutely not just a simple, entertaining scary story that I could eventually pause and walk away from, this was a highly predatory, ancient nightmare actively consuming my physical environment, layer by agonizing layer. I was completely trapped in a suffocating, deeply isolating paranoia, entirely unable to sleep, entirely unable to eat, entirely sustained only by the massive, toxic spikes of freezing adrenaline that violently flooded my system every single time the old house settled or the winter wind howled against the frosted glass. Then, the ultimate, mind-shattering physical escalation violently occurred late one freezing, completely windless Thursday night. The ambient temperature outside had plummeted significantly below freezing, completely trapping the isolated property in a dead, heavy, winter silence. I had desperately, quietly stepped entirely out of my dark master bedroom to get a single, pathetic glass of tap water from the kitchen, desperately hoping to soothe my dry, burning throat and physically ground my rapidly breaking mind. As I slowly, carefully walked back down the pitch-black central hallway, clutching the cold glass in my violently shaking hand, the harsh, sickly, pale moonlight aggressively bleeding through the front window entirely failed to illuminate the deep, suffocating shadows pooling densely at the very end of the corridor, exactly where the partially open door resided. I stopped perfectly, rigidly still in the exact center of the hallway, my frantically beating heart entirely stalling dead in my tight, cramping chest, my breathing instantly freezing in my lungs. Standing completely, perfectly still exactly at the absolute end of the long hallway, perfectly framed by the suffocating darkness of the open threshold, was the distinct, heavy silhouette of someone actively observing me. The towering, heavily obscured figure did not aggressively lunge toward me, and it did not make a single, microscopic sound. It simply stood there in the dead, freezing silence, a massive, unyielding wall of pure, unadulterated void that actively absorbed the faint ambient moonlight. Its highly unnatural, elongated proportions entirely rejecting the natural symmetry of a living, breathing human being. The entity was perfectly, flawlessly still, maintaining a heavy, statuesque, highly predatory patience that violently attacked my remaining, fragile sanity. I could not see a face, I could not see any defining physical features, but the sheer, crushing psychological weight of its unblinking gaze was immense, a heavily localized gravity that actively pulled the surrounding darkness entirely toward its massive frame. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't rationally process the sheer, massive scale of the terrifying, ancient nightmare I had completely, foolishly unleashed into my own secure sanctuary. The slow, creeping, highly toxic realization violently slammed directly into my chest exactly like a heavy iron sledgehammer, instantly and permanently freezing the hot blood rapidly circulating in my tired veins and entirely destroying my fundamental understanding of the situation. The slow, polite, methodical knocking that had originally haunted the closed door for weeks was absolutely never the sound of a desperate, trapped entity trying to forcefully break out of the sealed room. It possessed a completely different, deeply horrifying, ancient psychological purpose that completely bypassed my logical defenses. It was a formal, polite, highly calculated request. The ancient entity had absolutely no physical power to breach the boundary on its own, it had simply been patiently, eternally waiting in the suffocating darkness for my explicit, physical permission to come in. By willingly, deliberately turning the heavy brass deadbolt and completely cracking the ancient door open with my own trembling, human hands, I had actively, formally invited the massive, dark anomaly directly into the waking, earthly reality of my home. The knocking was never an escape attempt, it was a deeply predatory test, and I had fundamentally, permanently failed. I slowly, agonizingly backed entirely away from the towering, silent figure standing at the end of the hall, my cold, bare feet silently sliding across the hardwood floorboards, entirely terrified to break the heavy, unblinking visual contact with the shadow. I silently, desperately retreated entirely back into my master bedroom, forcefully pulling the heavy wooden door entirely shut and completely engaging the heavy brass lock with a loud, violently echoing click. My tight, cramping lungs finally drew in a massive, violently trembling gasp of the stale indoor air as I completely collapsed heavily onto my mattress. I completely pulled the thick winter quilts entirely over my sweating, pale face, entirely consumed by a raw, screaming, animalistic fear that completely erased my foundational understanding of physical safety. I desperately, pathetically wanted to completely believe that my locked bedroom was the absolute final, impenetrable sanctuary, a completely secure, isolated fortress that the towering, featureless entity could absolutely not breach without a second, explicit invitation. I lay perfectly, rigidly still in the heavy, freezing darkness for agonizing, endless hours, my highly sensitive ears actively straining to pierce through the dead, static silence of the sleeping house, completely listening for the heavy, wet sound of slow footsteps approaching my bedroom door. I expected the hallway floorboards to creak. I expected the heavy brass doorknob to slowly, methodically rattle in the dark. But the sprawling, isolated property remained flawlessly, perfectly, and entirely silent. The heavy, toxic barometric pressure violently saturating the room slowly, methodically began to ease, the freezing ambient temperature subtly rising to a normal, earthly degree, entirely tricking my exhausted, completely sleep-deprived brain into a false, highly fragile sense of earthly security. My heavy, burning eyes naturally, instinctively fluttered shut, entirely succumbing to the massive, overwhelming physical exhaustion actively crushing my nervous system. I drifted completely into a light, highly chaotic, deeply restless sleep, entirely unaware that the terrifying, impossible rules of this dark encounter had fundamentally, violently changed, and that the invitation I had granted applied to the entire physical architecture of my life. Sometime in the absolute, dead middle of the freezing, pitch-black night, I was abruptly, jarringly, and violently awakened by a sound that instantly paralyzed my freezing lungs and completely anchored my heavy body to the mattress. The silence in the room was deafening, a thick, suffocating blanket of absolute void. And then, the sound occurred. It was exactly 3 slow, calm, incredibly polite, highly methodical taps. Knock. 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 The deeply sickening, completely impossible realization instantly destroyed the absolute final, microscopic fragment of my remaining human sanity, violently plunging me into a permanent, inescapable psychological collapse. The heavy, rhythmic sound absolutely did not come from the heavy wooden door leading out into the dark central hallway. It was not echoing from the distant living room or the frozen kitchen. I slowly, agonizingly turned my wide, completely terrified, unblinking eyes entirely toward the dark, heavily shadowed corner of my pitch-black bedroom. The polite, gentle knocking was coming directly, clearly, and undeniably from inside the thin, hollow wooden panels of my own closed bedroom closet. This time, it was already inside the house.